The Hog That Dare Not Hunt by Day by Scott Odell, Chapter 24. The sun had set as I opened the gate, and Uncle Jack drove into the yard, unharnessed the horse, and let it loose. A warm light was shining through the front window, and there was a good smell of meat roasting in the fireplace. Our housekeeper, Millie, was a fine cook, having won prizes at the fair for her pigeon pies. I certainly liked her cooking better than what you get in London. My mouth was watering when I opened the door, thinking of the good things that Millie was cooking for supper. Millie was standing with her back to the fireplace, her hands clasped in front of her, an odd position, I thought, for her hands were always busy at something. She was staring at me, which was strange, too. Then I saw off to one side, not 5 steps away, a man, planted solid as a tree, with his feet apart and a pistol pointed in my direction. Coming out of the dark and into the light, I failed to recognize him at first, until he spoke, and then I knew it was Herbert Belsey, the searcher. Uncle Jack was still outside, bedding down the horse. He could have made a run for it and escaped had it not been for 3 armed men who were hiding in the barn. They put a knife at his throat and marched him into the kitchen. "What's this about? An outrage! Outrage!" Uncle Jack shouted, glaring around. "We'll explain that later, when you have more time," Herbert Belsey said, giving him a flat stare. "Get your clothes together and all your money. You'll need both where you're going." "An outrage!" Uncle Jack shouted again. "A man not safe in his own home. Outrage! The sheriff! Where's the sheriff?" "We have a flood tide," Belsey said, not raising his voice. "We plan to make it." There was a loaded musket hanging above the fireplace. Uncle Jack was too far away to get his hands on it, but all Millie needed to do was reach up and in one movement pull the trigger. A shot would alert the village. Everyone knew that signal, having heard it before. Every villager would grab a weapon and come running. Uncle Jack gave Millie a clear signal, but she missed it. She looked at him puzzled and stood by the fire, wringing her hands. None of the armed officers was bothering with me, probably because of my youth, my pink cheek look of innocence. I edged towards the fireplace, stopped to turn down a lamp that was beginning to smoke, then moved on to the fireplace and stood beside Millie, within reach of the loaded musket. "Move," Belsey said to Uncle Jack. Thereupon 3 of the officers prodded him with a steel-tipped staff. 2 others brandished their swords. Now was the time for me to act, to sound the alarm that would bring the villagers like a swarm of hornets down upon Belsey and his gang. I turned and quickly reached for the musket. I even had a finger on the trigger, but by a split second, I was not quick enough. A steel-tipped spike caught me on the forearm, a blow that brought a choking pain to my throat. I staggered back and fell to the hearth. "Up," an officer said quietly, prodding me with the sharp point of his sword. "Move, both of you. The tide's not waiting." Uncle Jack pulled himself up to his full height, which meant that he had to check his head to keep from bumping into the beams. "Do you know that you are addressing the owner of the ship Black Pearl, a ship of considerable value, registered in the king's books, a legitimate trader on the king's highways, upon the seas of the world? Do you understand what I say, eh? Do you comprehend the consequences of your outrageous behavior? Outrageous, I say." Belsey appeared to listen, but his eyes moved slowly around the room, as if he were counting the value of each item: tables, chair, chests, rug, everything. When Uncle Jack had finished, Belsey said, "You speak of yourself as the owner of the ship Black Pearl. Did I hear you aright?" Uncle Jack did not hesitate, though he might well have. "You hear aright, the owner, the legal owner." The men brandished their weapons. If Uncle Jack had held a sword in his hand, he could have cleared the whole room of Belsi and his men. It was too late now to sound an alarm and bring the townspeople running. Yet there was one last hope. Millie had a piercing call that could bring cows in from a mile away. In fact, she had won a prize once at a fair for her cow calling. Alas, too frightened to scream, too scared even to speak, she stood in front of the fireplace, still wringing her hands. Belsi had a whip in his hand, and he gave Uncle Jack a clout with it. The 5 officers, staffs, and swords in hand, shoved us through the door, down the dock, up the gangplank, and on to the ship. Dogs began to bark in the village, not a quarter mile away, and for a moment I had hopes that they would start an alarm, but the barking ceased of a sudden. The officers cast off the lines, and we drifted out into the stream, heading southward towards its meeting with the Thames. Only then, as we began to move downstream, did Millie come alive. She came running out of the house, skirts flying and hands raised to heaven, giving forth at the top of her lungs her prize-winning cow call. Doors were flung open in the village and lights shone suddenly across the river. Dogs began to bark again. Men were running. A musket went off. Millie continued to scream, but by now the ship had moved away from the dock and was gaining speed. We rounded a bend, met the back current of the Thames, were caught by the incoming tide, whirled about, and headed upstream in a surging rush toward London. Uncle Jack and I were herded into what once had been his cabin, bound hand and foot, and left there on the floor. "What happened to the gold?" I whispered to him when things had quieted down outside. "Toss it in the bushes," he whispered back. "Millie will find it before the night's out." Millie's good at finding things. "We'll need it in London." That and more. Greedy palms there in London, and a lot of them. Searchers watched by other searchers, who in turn are watched by other searchers. 3 different sets of searchers, spying on each other, all at once, all with their hands out. Dogs eating dogs, eh? "We're carrying no contraband," Uncle Jack went on. "No corn, no wool, no iron, no leather, nothing. And we've a pink ticket to prove it. Nothing, clean as a whistle we are, and every last Bible sold and delivered." A creaking boot stopped at the door. I gave Uncle Jack a warning look, and we both fell silent. I lay there on the cabin floor, in pain from the ropes that bound me, but still the pain was mild against an overpowering fear. We were, as Uncle Jack had said, clean as a whistle, with a docket to prove it. "It puzzles my thoughts," Uncle Jack whispered. "Just 3 weeks ago, the office of the Surveyor of Customs dared not risk a surprise check on his books, so after dark he sent his servant to climb in the window and steal the documents. Time being short and no chance to alter the records, the surveyor thereupon made a bonfire of the lot. A big fire. Burned up most of the records, burned most of the office." "What's that to do with us?" I asked. "Plenty enough," Uncle Jack said. "The only records they have against me, against us, were burned up in that bonfire. Most of them, at least." As I lay there, bound hand and foot, thinking hard about our plight, Uncle Jack's story somehow did not reassure me. End of chapter 24.